Michael Lissack and Brenden Meagher. So I've known Michael for a long time. And I told him he's a difficult man to introduce concisely, just because of the many facets of what he does. On his website, I think you present yourself as realtor, entrepreneur, applied philosopher in that order.
No, exact opposite order, but that's all right.
Okay, my computer's running backwards, but that only scratches a few of the surfaces. I mean, I've known Michael through our work together with the American Society for Cybernetics, where he was past president, I was past vice president. He's been visiting professor at George Washington University, I believe it was in the business school. Currently involved with as professor at Tongji University, the design school in China. Before that, had a long career as an investor, investment banker. With Smith Barney. That's a whole other tangent I won't go off on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This multifaceted background really gives him advantages that make him really interesting in what I understand is his passion, or at least where I see value in the work that he does, which is going to the root of our ways of thinking and the assumptions that underlie them, the different paradigms of thinking that we apply either out of habit or intentionally in the areas of design, in the areas of politics, in the areas of science, in the areas of business. And in a way, sort of opening up, making us aware of what are the assumptions that underlie these, and are we using them in a way that is serving the correct purpose. This, you can see by the title of the lecture, is very much in this vein. Brenden I've known just for about an hour since he walked in, but I understand you are at Boston University, where yes. You're a health sciences student. Yes. But also working with Michael and PhD through Tongji University. Yes, if that's correct. So also an indication of an interesting interdisciplinarity. But I don't want to take any more of your time, so I'll hand it over to Michael and Brenden.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a very, shall we say, strong quote. And I'm going to politely suggest to you that one of the perils of design thinking, policy thinking, et cetera, is that there is a monster, and that monster actually does create an abyss. And the monster is simplicity. We are raised to think that simplicity is marvelous, and maybe it isn't. So these are the things that people say, simplicity helps you with coherence, it's delightful, it allows you to focus on function, keep it simple, all those other nice things. Great value statement. But, so, again, you see more of it. This is, I believe Staples even has an easy button for simplicity. You can buy. You want one on your desk. All right. And of course, we're, design thinking process. And one of the things in the design thinking process is a result. You want to produce a result. You want to have a function, an artifact, something that comes out of the process. And if the something that comes out of the process has an obvious use, an obvious function, how to use it is simple, that's a good thing. That's a good value. Right? So again, going through design with the idea that there's a solution at the far end. So you are going through the processes, you might iterate inputs, you might take user feedback, but the idea is come up with a result and put the result to use. It's a great thinking model in a simple world. unfortunately, we don't necessarily live in a simple world. So again, in the public policy process, it becomes more circular. And when we get a result, and if see, the laser doesn't work on the TV screen. All right. So if you get to implementation and then you go back and reevaluate. So now it's getting a little more complex and it becomes more iterative. But we live in a media world. We live in a world of sound bites. We live in a world that is dominated by a set of interpreters who don't actually have a lot of background. So our journalists are not taught in the subject and then become a journalist. They're taught to be a journalist, and they have a very surface, simplistic understanding of the subject. Most of the explanations that occur in the policy world come from the media and communications people who were not trained in the policy or in any of the subtleties. So they were trained in coming up with how to give you a simple soundbite. Most of the policy world is not simple. So there's a mismatch here. Science. Now, please notice now, instead of it being a circle, what ends up happening in science is you draw a conclusion, but you don't produce an artifact. You don't actually get a result. All that happens with a conclusion is a set of more questions. It just launches you onto the next problem. So while the policy one was a circle and the design one had an output, the science one is sort of an ever-going spiral where you get a new problem and you get a new problem and you get a new problem. Hello, we're in the age of COVID. And Brendan's going to talk to you more about healthcare examples. But in the age of COVID, science and that's design method and policy all got shoved together, giant conflation. And we have media communicators who are telling you about policy. And worse, we have policymakers who are making policy, and they're doing it from the simplistic understandings like a journalist. They're not going into the depth. They're not exploring the nuances. And if all the object is to produce a result that can be talked about on TV, they're doing great. I'll point out everyone in this room except me is wearing a mask. Well, except him at the moment. You know, why? Do we know why? Brendan's going to get into that a little bit, right? We flew here on an airplane. No one asked for vaccinations on an airplane. Or at a conference at the Hilton Netherlander. We're not allowed to go to the conference without showing our vaccination certificates. Can anyone explain the nuances of this? Right, but what's it based on? And please don't tell me, oh, it's the science with a capital S. And if you're going to tell me that, then I'm going to tell you, yeah, and I'm Dr. Fauci and I personalize science. Sure. All right, so design thinking in its native form, public policy in its form, and the way many people make use of the scientific method are all aimed at getting our result. If the laser worked, I would point out that little orange piece that he's trying to put in to make it work. But is that good enough? Does that actually help you deal with how today is organized? That's the byword. Doesn't work. So when there isn't necessarily simplicity, we're human. We go about creating simplicity. We will impose it where it may not be. We create it in our minds. Because if simplicity is how you succeed, then we need simplicity. It's very simple. We do this through a black box. We now take a collection of inputs. We assert that there's an output at the other end, and the processes that go on in the middle, well, that's the black box. Many people in the US think our COVID policies are black boxes. No understanding of what goes into them. They just know this happened in the news. This is the result. No explanation in the middle. Many of the things that go on in bureaucracies, be it a university bureaucracy, anything else, same thing. It's what happens? How does it work? So a black box actually has a second component that we don't think about. And the second component is an observer. See, this is where Tim and I's cybernetic stuff comes in is, oh, hello, enter the observer. So the observer looks at the output from the black box and may now be making some contribution into the input. When it works, you get a nice one of those feedback loops, and now we're into that nice little policy loop that we had before. If you're a scientist, this clicker likes to do things on me. So when it works, the scientist will make use of their observations, put them back into the black box and see what happens. Voting, in theory, is a way of dealing with the observers in the black box. And then, of course, we have the Vladimir Putin method of dealing with the black box, which is coercion and force do wonders at deciding, no, the black box is going to operate the way I, Vladimir Putin, want it to operate. The rest of you people, that doesn't matter. So black boxes are simplifications that we construct. They allow us to talk about the world as if it was X. And that as if assumption is very important. We may say X is Y. What we really mean is we are going to talk about X as if it were Y. We just don't say that. And it is really important to think about that the as if is there. Now I'm going to put on my philosopher hat for a minute. If you, in philosophy, if you are a realist, then you say X is Y and you mean X is Y. If you are a constructivist, you mean I will talk about X as if it were Y. And you recognize that the Y part is a human construction in your head. Many of us use metaphors. When you use metaphors, we tend to talk about what things are like, right? A metaphor is how are two things like each other? But there's a second part to a metaphor. All the differences. Everything that you left out is how things are different. But when we talk about things as if they were like something else, we tend not to talk about the differences. We only like to talk about the metaphorical, how it's the same. Again, to me, a dangerous simplification. Usually what matters much more is the differences, not the similarities. So you can deal with complexity by trying to work your way through the maze or by going around it. I think you put timings in the slides is what's happened. So if you go around it, you're not dealing with any of the stuff that's in that maze. And that may work in some contexts. But it may also be very dangerous. And if you don't ask in which context the going around it works, you have a problem. You are just assuming and as if that this going around is efficient. And it's simple and it might be efficient. But it might ignore most of the things that are actually occurring. And it may be that you really do have to deal with all the stuff in the maze. So I'm going to give you an article from me and a quote from Nicholas Taleb in his book, Antifragile, which is, if you're looking for the simplicities, if you're looking for the certainties, if you're looking for the little things that by definition work, you may be overlooking all the stuff that's important. Now you can get there. Talib's book is all about, if you do it, what you're doing is creating a very fragile situation. All of the contexts, all of the constraints have to be right, and then it works perfectly. So within that world of a set of constraints and a set of contexts, your simple solution just works. What you've ignored is that you've imposed, as a human, you have imposed the conditions that allow that thing to work and to thrive. And when those boundary conditions are violated, things can fall apart very quickly. So now I'll switch to a far more impressive person to quote. I'll go back to my Nietzsche quote in the beginning. The false assumption and the misrepresentations tend to be based on the idea that simplicity works. And don't talk about the idea that simplicity only works within a context and within a set of constraints. Now, in the world of complex systems, people talk about self-organization. How many in this room have heard self-organization as a term before? All right, so I will point out to you that the man that coined that term, Ilya Prigogine, points out that it was a mistake. It was a translation error. He meant self-contained. Self-organization happens when you impose a boundary condition. All right, and then that which occurs inside the boundary appears to be self-organizing, whether or not there's actually any selves in there to do it. What's happening is an interaction between the system that's inside the boundary and the boundary. And that's what's creating the organization. Simplicity is no different. There are contexts in which it works great. I'm not sure policy is one of them. All right, now, how many of you are familiar with one of the greatest American philosophers of the 20th and 21st century? Did anyone study Stephen Colbert in their philosophy class? But this may be one of the best things that's happened to us in this century. Colbert came up with this interesting concept, truthies and truthiness. So a truthy is not a truth. There's no factual basis. You don't have to do any research. You don't have to put any foundation underneath what you're saying. It's a truthy if it feels right to you. If it coheres with your inner sense of what is and is not. Of course, your inner sense may change all the time. So therefore, what is true in a truthy changes all the time. With all due respect, if there are Republicans in the room, I apologize. We had a president who believed in truthies. He very firmly believed in truthies. It is quite clear Vladimir Putin believes in truthies. Now, one aspect of truthies is you pick the thing that you think feels right and you focus on it. Well, there's this little law called Goodhearts Law. Have any of you heard of this before? And this is actually a variant of it from a lady named Margaret Streatham, who is in Britain. But so this is the Streatham variant of Goodhearts Law. But it basically says if you start focusing on something and you base your measurements on it, if that becomes the target, it's no longer a good measure. So the examples, if you measure people on the number of nails made, you get thousands of tiny nails. If you measure it on weight, you will get some giant nails. There's things that are missing in this concept. But picking a target measure is what we all learn to do. It's a good academic practice. It's a good science practice. It's a good policy practice. It just causes distortions because it's too simple. And with that, I'm going to give it to Brenden to go through some more examples.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me in the back? I'm going to keep it on.
Okay.
So some examples. Publishing bias. What is publishing bias? It's this tendency for researchers and scientists to only publish and submit to journals their positive results, the results that look good on paper, and the results that prove that this medicine will cure this disease. That's what makes the most money, that's what looks the best. Yet, there are so many results that come out of studies that are also just as good. They're just not the hypothesis, and they have nothing to do with the hypothesis. And even sometimes they do have to do with the hypothesis, but if they're not positive, if they don't make the impact that the authors were looking to make, then they'll just forget about it. And that leads to these issues of bias. And meta-analyses, researchers will go in and look at many journals and read many articles and try to gather this idea that they're trying to hit. They'll try and get background and information and get context. Yet, how can you get context, all of the context on an issue, if the sources that you're using are already curated towards positive results? How can you look at the negative results? You can't. We need to consider all parts of the circumstances here. How do we get the data that we have? Is there a use for this data results? You know, I'd like to say that we should publish based on quality, not on what our study has found. So now, some more topical public health examples, more specific. Hydroxychloroquine, you may have heard of it. It caused a lot of drama and politics and controversy, and some people got sick from it, and some people, I don't know, they took it and they weren't supposed to. But hydroxychloroquine was this potential cure for COVID-19. It was advertised everywhere in media. It was talked about. It was on social media. It was in circles. Everyone was thinking, okay, could this be it? Could this be the cure? And with all that excitement, people jumped to conclusions that it was the cure. And all that was behind those jumps to conclusions, at first at least, was one small study that was later proved to be inconclusive. And this study didn't have a great sample size. It was run correctly, but if you're not sampling the population correctly, then the results of your study might not be applicable to everyone. Now, what happened was the study came out and it said hydroxychloroquine can potentially, help with COVID-19. And the media took this and said, oh my gosh, like, we're going to be okay. And everyone that wanted to hear that, including me, was like, oh my gosh, we're going to be okay. We have drugs that can do this. And before this, I had never heard of this drug, yet now we have people taking it. They shouldn't be taking it. We have people that actually need it. They can't get it. Creates this whole issue just because of this study that was too small. Second example of masks. At first, in the beginning of 2020, I wasn't wearing a mask. I first found out about COVID in February, March 2020. I remember I was in my dorm. I was leaving, moving out, going back home, and I wasn't wearing a mask. Some people were, and I was like, should I be? I don't know. No one's really told me whether I should be. I just won't wear one for now. And looking back, it was in May, and I was like, oh my gosh, how could I have not been wearing a mask? And this is 2020. How can the information be so confusing? How can the CDC not tell us the best thing at the best moment? Well, I don't know, but things could have been different. So this comes back to bad communication. If the CDC had told us everything, the entire story about masks, maybe things would have been better. We know that people have been using masks in hospitals for years. Masks were not invented in 2019 or 2018. Why couldn't the CDC say, okay, if you have masks, wear them? That's okay. There's much more to be explained than just don't do anything, don't wear it. But what about homemade masks? That doesn't shift the supply anywhere. We could all make homemade masks. So it comes back to decisions and explanations, and also the complexity about masks. That's also a part of it too. the case for masks was made without consideration of how one actually catches COVID-19. So at first we were unsure about fomites and other things, and I'll get to that in my next slide, but what about aerosols? What about concentration? What about ventilation? It's not simple. Yet masks, if it was explained by the media, by the CDC, by everyone else, this is just something we should be doing. We should try our best to do this. Things might have been different. So here we are, fomites. Fomites are the surfaces or the objects that transfer bacteria and viruses from one thing to another. So let's say if I cough and I'm sick, if I cough on this table here, then Michael touches this table, touches his face, he gets sick. Now there's many fomites in that situation, one the table, two his hand. And that's what fomites are. Now, in the beginning of the pandemic, this was a major focus for everyone. I mean, I know myself included, I was cleaning my groceries and excessively washing my hands and using hand sanitizer in October of last year, yet I knew for many months that this wasn't a big issue with COVID-19 things. But nonetheless, unnecessary anxiety, spending on cleaning supplies that we didn't need, excessive cleaning supplies, that is, and energy. Now, why did this happen? And why did it take so long to come back and say, okay, what are the real issues here? It's because there was jumps to conclusions. There was this misguided focus on what the real dangers are because people rushed to find answers, and there was shortcuts that were taken. So lack of rigor in the studies, and studies were being pushed through the process of peer review faster than it normally would be. And that's okay. That was necessary. However, the media didn't explain that. They didn't explain very well that some of the science isn't the entire answer. One article that's published in Nature doesn't give you the full picture. It's not simple. It's very complex. Yet, when that's not explained, anything can happen. So my last example with explicitly COVID-related things is vitamin D. Now, this has been being talked about for a while, and there was a new study that came out recently that explained that, well, it showed that people that have a lower amount of vitamin D in their bodies before a COVID infection have worse symptoms. They're worse off. Okay, that's not good. So let's assume this study is valid and it's replicatable, and there's many studies that produce this. Okay, so now we can look at this and say, wow, low levels of vitamin D, bad COVID outcome. Well, let's just start supplementing vitamin D. Let's all go out and buy it. The media might say, you should go to your store right now and get vitamin D before it runs out. However, we've missed our critical step here. The rigor and the explanation and all of that in saying, well, if vitamin D causes this, we should increase vitamin D. Well, the body is complex, and there's other systems in the body that correlate with other systems. One thing does not cause this one outcome just because we see this in a study. What if there's a system in the body that causes low vitamin D, and that system is responsible for producing a bad immune response, but the actual vitamin D is not the cause of the negative COVID outcome? Correlation does not equal causation. It never has, and it never will. So we need to do more research to understand, well, actually, if you supplement vitamin D, it's not even as good as getting it from, say, fortified dairy products or salmon. So even if vitamin D did literally cause you to have better COVID outcomes if you were infected, supplementation wouldn't actually help. That's also misunderstood. We don't fully understand that. So to make the multi-step jump from the studies that were valid and correct and real, saying that people with less vitamin D in their bodies before COVID infection produce, healthier outcomes, all the way to you should take vitamin D, is sloppy science. There's too many steps skipped. So randomized control trials are these gold standards of research that we have. And they test, usually they're testing to see if drugs work or therapies are effective. And they'll have two groups randomized, meaning that they're equal. And that if you give one group the medicine or the therapy and another group nothing or a placebo, your results should be valid. And the study should be able to tell you that, yes, this medication worked or did not work. Yet, even RCTs have limitations. And I could go on for this forever, but I don't want to take up too much more of your time. RCTs are literally known as the gold standard in research practices. Yet, if we take them and we say anything that an RCT produces or any results that are yielded from these studies are truth and are the way we should be doing things, or this is immediately a medication, we should start making it mass production. We can't do that because, well, it's just sloppy science. You need to investigate more. You need to reproduce things. You know, if one RCT is published and they sampled a population of 600,000, but then in a different country, they cannot even reproduce the study, does that mean we should be pushing these medications that the study said originally were great? I don't think so. All right, I'm back to Michael.
All right, so we live in a world that is complex, but we're told we should be looking for the simple. We're the humans here. You know, how are we choosing what's going on? What are we making this choice about? Complex versus simple. So one of the things that goes on is that we're human. And how many of you heard the famous George Miller thing, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2? All right, for those who haven't, our working memory, the part of our brain that deals with the here and the now, has been shown through neuroscience that we can deal with somewhere between 3 and 7 unrelated variables at the same time. That's it. We do not have the cognitive equipment to deal with more than that. We don't live in a world that is describable by only 3 to 7 unrelated variables at the same time. So we are living in a world that we do not have the cognitive equipment to actually fully grasp. At any and all times, we can only deal with some portion of the world. And again, the human in you picks what portion of the world it is you're going to deal with. What is it you're paying attention to, either consciously or subconsciously? That's what your cognitive limits will have to deal with. Now, in the policy arena, I would politely suggest to you that limiting your focus to those 3 to 7 things and picking something simple usually does not get you the right answer. Things are usually more complex and more nuanced than that nice, simple approach of come up with something simple and get a nice, clean result and it'll work. Brenden gave you lots of examples of simple things that prove not to be so simple. All right. So there's a cybernetics principle that I have no idea whether people in the room other than Tim have ever heard of, called the law of requisite variety. And it is very important. If you're going to make policy, if you're going to try to impose some kind of control on a system, then the degrees of freedom in your controller, the variables that get considered, and the degrees of freedom in the system that you're trying to control must line up. When they don't line up, you end up with either under control or over control. So if the controller, you, the human, starts thinking about too many variables, you're going to have a model that is much too complex, and you're not going to know what to do with it. On the other hand, if you underspecify, so the system that you're dealing with actually involves 5 variables, and you only pick 2 to control, You may be lucky and you may be in a context where the situation is controlling the rest of them. But by only focusing on those two, you are under controlling. So as an example, you'll notice that the shape on the left does not have any way of dealing with that yellow circle. That controller does not have enough variety in it to work. So whenever the yellow circle matters, that controller cannot deal with it. The one on the right has another cutout where the yellow circle does fit. So the one on the right has requisite variety and the one on the left does not. So far, two very critical concepts as we're building this argument. You've got cognitive limits and requisite variety matters. And now we're going to get, unfortunately, to the complicated one. All right, something that I have not. How many people in here have taken a statistics class? How many of you remember something called Jensens Inequality? This may be the most important statistical principle you could have learned, and you probably skipped right over it. And it's actually the one that determines almost everything that goes on. So Jensens, don't worry, you don't have to master the math. Jensens says that if you have a population of things and you have some function that you want to apply to the population, you cannot take a shortcut. So if you apply the function to the average of the population, or to a sample, or to a simulation, etc., what you get as a result is not the same as if you apply the function to every member of the population and then you look for the average of the sample, etc. Unless the function is linear, these things will not be equal. We learn this in an introductory statistics class and we proceed to forget about it. But it is the source of almost every policy mistake. It is simpler and easier to focus on averages, samples, and simulations than on the population as a whole. So you decide I can apply the function to my little thing, and I'm talking about the big thing. That's just up there to scare you that it really is a lot of math, but don't worry. The concept itself is fairly simple. Applying a function to a shortcut is not the same as applying the function to the whole, and it's not transitive. You cannot flip these things around. So again, Jensens applies to all nonlinear functions. Now, there are two solutions. Solution one is to play with the function and make it linear. So how many of you ever seen a piece of log-log graph paper? I can take a nice parabolic function that certainly is not linear, and if I put it on log-log paper, hello, it's linear. Jensens goes away if I just do the log-log of the function. No problem. Now it's transitive. So that's one solution. The second solution is the restrict the context, impose constraints, create a boundary so that you're only looking at a portion of the population or a context for the population to thrive in where the function can be linear. So the design thinking approach is let's unify both A and B and figure out in what set of users, in what context, subject to what constraints, gives us a linear function. We're back to simple. We can produce a result. Everything we learned based on simplicity is good works from unifying A and B. So if we unify A and B, we can generate an application that gets used within that context, subject to those constraints, et cetera, but great. Right? There are baby diapers and there are adult diapers, and most of the people that are middle-aged in between don't walk around with either of them. It works. All right, then there's the scientific method approach, which is very different. So the scientific method approach asks the same questions, which users in what context and what constraints, but it wants to know what's the difference between trying A, where I try to make the function linear, and B, by narrowing the context where the function just results in being linear. So science is asking about differences between A and B. And design thinking is saying, how do I make use of A and B to produce a result? A Gregory Bateson quote is that information is the difference that makes a difference. So the science method is focusing on differences, which then leads to asking questions and generating new meaning and that nice iterative spiral that I showed you earlier. You're not trying to get an artifact. You're not trying to get a result. You're not trying to get a policy. You're just trying to generate more questions. Now, policymakers are not scientists. The general public would not tolerate it if all you did was run a continuous experiment. So there's a balance here that has to go on, requisite variety again, between what things it is that you're using. So our 3 lessons, right? So the scientific method approach, again, it's generating new questions, new meaning. So we hit 3 things. You've got cognitive limits. You need to think about requisite variety, and you can't overlook Jensen. It may be complicated. It may look like nasty math, but ignore it at your peril. All right, so the design thinking approach, outcomes. The scientific method approach is what processes can we do? And again, requisite variety says there's some balance here. And if you're going to be in the policy world, you need to be trying to find a balance. Policy should not just be adopted and forgotten about. That doesn't work. Right? You need to be asking questions about them. But it may be that you can produce a thing and the thing works really well. And I'll use as an example, this is a 12-year-old clicker. Computers have evolved greatly. This thing was designed for Windows 95. It works really well and it was $20. Right? So from a design point of view, this is a great item. It still works really well. Years later, cheap, simple, functions. Policies don't tend to work that way. The world changes around them and they no longer might fit. So I'm going to give you a Richard Rorty quote. Now, Richard is a pragmatist. All right? And we're not trying to get things right. We're trying to make them copable. The idea is, how do we go about coping? What do we do that allows us to cope? So if you just base your policy on outcomes, on simple things, you are likely to produce a fragile policy. There may be some context, some bounded area where the policy works really well. But the minute that the context changes or the constraints get altered, or something that you didn't think about enters into the picture, requisite variety will rear its ugly head, fragility will assert itself, and your policy is likely to be very fragile. And as we know in COVID, fragile policies may not be the way we can cope. So asking questions is the key, and that's your 4th lesson. Ask questions. You've got cognitive limits, requisite variety matters, Jensen cannot be ignored, and the way to deal with this is to be asking questions. So I've got some questions up there that one should always ask. Are we looking at the right things? Are we sufficiently self-aware of the lenses that we're using to look at things? What are the beliefs through which we're looking? Do we have the right way of expressing what it is we're looking at? Be those words or models or gadget, whatever. And finally, are we self-aware enough to know the limitations of what we know and what we don't know? These questions are critical. So shortcuts always depend on what it is that allows them to work. If you take a shortcut, they depend on something. So the questions are, what assumptions? What context? What is it that affords meaning from within the shortcut? What is it about your beliefs in your head or the context in the outside world that gives the shortcut meaning? What is it you need to know to even understand what the shortcut is? Always, this is the takeaway, always ask what it is that allows a given shortcut to work. Is it your belief system? Is it requisite variety? Is it Jensens? Is it a context? Is it a set of constraints? You're using a shortcut. What gives that shortcut meaning? What is it that allows that shortcut to work? If you don't make the affordances that allow shortcuts to work, you can have bad science and you can have bad policy. So the trick is to be making these things explicit. Ask the questions and generate answers. So, I mean, here's an example from science where somebody starts off with something, doesn't ask any of the questions, gets a group of people to go about doing more research on it. They self-cite, they self-publish, everybody cites it together. It becomes the accepted byword. So I'll go back to Brendan's Fomite example. For 6 months, we all washed our hands scrupulously, and we weren't on cruise ships where norovirus matters. We cared about what we touched, etc. And then we discovered, hello, COVID doesn't have surface transmission. Why are we doing all these things? It has aerosol transmission, which we were not focusing on at all. So while we're busy cleaning surfaces, we should have been investing in better ventilation systems. It was just bad because we took a shortcut and we self-cited and it went on from there. And nobody questioned what that shortcut was based on. We cannot afford that kind of thing in a pandemic. We can't afford it when there's a potential for World War III going on. We can't afford it when the economy is having issues. There are many places where unexamined shortcuts are just flat out dangerous. This speaks for itself. So our future depends, or it might depend, on you, your generation. I'm old. Asking about shortcuts, asking to understand what things are based on, trying to get the hidden stuff made explicit. Thanks.
For some questions, I understand some students have to.
If you need to leave, I'm not going to be insulted. It's okay.
We'll give those students priority in
Yes.
asking questions. Others who can hang on are very welcome to speak.
Yeah.
What do you see as the biggest problem going forward in the next 5 years in association with policy and how maybe in a general sense, like it affects people here as well as all across the United States and perhaps in the world?
A lack of co-training. So people learn the art of policy making. They go to a policy or planning school, but they don't necessarily learn the substance about what in depth of the policies that they're making. It's the same problem I told you with journalists. You know, we used to have people who went to college and let's say they studied, I don't know, economics, and then they became a journalist that talked about economics. Now they go to journalism school and their boss assigns them to the economics beat and they use Google and Wikipedia to tell you about economics. It doesn't help when our policymakers, who may know a lot about process, don't know a lot about substance. It's a big risk. And we've been in a society that encourages truthies, and shallowness and immediate results. We have the internet that gives you Wikipedia and all this other garbage. And some of it may be fine, but it's not something to base policy on. And we had 4 years of a president who literally based his policies on what he heard from 3 people on Fox News and what he talked about with his children that night. That doesn't work. We have Vladimir Putin, who doesn't seem to talk to anybody, who's invented in his own mind world history and is engaging in a war based on his own delusion. And thousands of people are dying. That doesn't work. We have all the mistakes that went on with these. The biggest risk for the next 5 years is a mismatch between people who have focused on process and think therefore they're able to do whatever without the substance behind it. Now, the flip side is also true. It does not help having people like Dr. Fauci, who may be a public health expert, telling you how to run the economy. Because he's got no expertise there either.
We have a comment from one of our attendants that says, policymakers are usually not policy experts.
Right. So the question becomes, how do the policy experts articulate, explicate, explain in a manner that the policymaker can relate to? Again, what is it about the shortcuts the policymaker understands that you can relate to in order to convey the necessary depth? Do you just ignore the fact that these people don't know, or do you try to help them overcome what they don't know by recognizing that that's a constraint that has to be dealt with?
Can I ask a question from over
Wait.
online? So the internet has created an economy of the transmission of information that is so widespread that it's changed what media is and how media works. So I really have a problem with your characterization of journalism, and I think it's an oversimplification, to say that journalists are not experts in their subject matter when there is a capitalist consolidation of media as the exchange of information has gotten closer to the way that people entertain themselves. So there is a limited market for the kinds of information that we might have called news 50 years ago. And journalism is experiencing pressures from media producers.
I'm not disagreeing with what you said. I'm just going to point out that to the extent that we have policymakers relying on journalists, and that's the feedback loop, that the lack of subject matter expertise and in-depth knowledge of context, because that may be acceptable as entertainment, turns around and has a feedback loop back into policy that is extremely dangerous.
Policymakers do not need to listen to the media. They can choose to listen to policy experts.
They could. I'm not going to tell you that, but I know what we see on TV that many of them do. All right, I'm going to jump to somebody else in the room. There were a couple of hands up.
So I'm kind of confused between your characterization of simplification and simplicity. So I see simplification in the process, while simplicity can be one outcome of the process. Can you develop that? Because I've seen that the two words were in some way in the first part of your presentation, it mixed.
Yes. The media presentation, the book presentation, et cetera, is you want things to be as simple as possible. Then we have to take into account the Einstein constraint, but not simpler. People forget that last part.
So if you are engaged in simplification and you remember the Einstein constraint, simplification works. It's a great goal. Again, we have limited cognitive capabilities. When you simplify the process of simplification and its goals, and you leave out the Einstein constraint, you tend to overshoot. So now you end up producing simplicity that is very bounded in where it works. And so I'm going to agree with you. I mean, the conflation in the beginning was on purpose. Simplification with requisite variety, taking into account the need to ask questions and the recognition that Jensen is there, is a great process. And it's necessary. We don't have the cognitive equipment to deal with things otherwise. But if you leave out all those things and you just say, oh, simplify, you end up with, I will use the current events example. The nuances are you're not supposed to take over some other country's sovereignty and their territory and a democratically elected government, et cetera. But Vladimir Putin has simplified this. Ukraine's really part of Russia. I'm not invading. There is no sovereignty to overwhelm. And it really doesn't matter what those people think because I'm the boss of Russia. He threw out all those other things and simplified. And in his mind, he's sure he's right. And all the people living through it, unfortunately, have to deal with all those things that he cast aside. 1, 2, yeah.
So a lot of the examples that you gave are like federal entities, like the CDC, for example, and their tendency to oversimplify. I think in my personal experience, I've noticed that local government and local policymakers, they're more likely to consult the on-the-ground experts, like the people who live things day to day. And I guess I just wanted to know a little bit of your perspective on that, like if you agree, or if you have examples of local government doing the same thing that federal entities do and oversimplifying in that same way.
Okay, so when you say local government, I'm going to point out to you, we're in the US. We've got tens of thousands, if not more, of units of local government. Some of them are staffed by people that are well paid, have expertise and time, and can do the things that we would all like them to do. Others of them have no resources, are volunteers, and quite frankly, have no idea what they're doing. So I was an investment banker and I financed infrastructure projects all over the United States. So the picture that you want to paint of local government can do a good job, yes, in some places there are great people in local government that can do a good job. And then you go to other places and the guy who cuts your hair is making the decisions on a $100 million budget. And he has a GED. He's simplifying. He doesn't really have a choice. And the people that live there have to deal with his simplifications. That's just the way it is. So yes, there are levels of local government where there's great. And there's other levels of local government where we could only wish it were that way, but that isn't the way it is.
Yeah, I have a question about the science, as you mentioned. And God, in the end, you said we cannot afford sloppy science. I agree with you on that. But I feel like the problem, if it's sloppy science, of course, right? But a lot of times the science may not be sloppy. The science has a limitation. And even maybe we think back now, we know the science was wrong, but back then we didn't know that was wrong. So that how I'd like to hear your conclusion. Try to see how can we afford this limitation of science? So not a sloppy science.
All right, I'm going to take a first cut. All right, I'm going to give you one snippet. I'm going to let Brenden take this. If you recognize and make explicit the limitations of the science, that's how you avoid the sloppiness, and it's fine. When you fail to do that, and you assert that whatever you've done is science with a capital S, and it's truth with a capital T, you are running the risks. So it may be that the scientist doing it is doing fine, but the communicator about the science is screwing it all up.
Right, that's what I was basically gonna say, like, science has limitations and that's okay. And as long as people are like, fully explaining their results, fully explaining their methods and their presuppositions, then everything is fine. It's all in that study. The problem is when other people read it and they'll read just the abstract and then write their article, or read just the abstract and tell their best friend. That's what the problem is. I want to give you a chance to respond, but I know you had your hand up. Do you still want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was kind of for both of you, it was kind of the
Yes, but I
question
had it.
about media's difference and all that. I mean, you can easily say that it's both good and bad, but what are kind of your opinions on? I mean, it gives us the ability to kind of worldwide see more things and not have that more narrow-minded view. What are your kind of perceptions? I mean, I think it goes back and forth about the truthiness of it and what's correct and what's just factual based and whatnot, but what's kind of your guys' thoughts on where that's leading in the next 5 years and its impact on where we're headed?
So I think there's always room for opinion pieces. There's always room for media to branch out and do what they want to do, and that's expected. That's what they should do. As far as like the future, I don't see it changing, but I would hope that people take more time to read, and maybe that these are still used, but they're explained more. Maybe like TLDR starts to become TLDR, but like also this isn't the full picture. You want to expand on that?
Of course, TLDR is too long, didn't read. And, you know, again, so let's start with Jack Welch or GE. Don't give me a memo that's more than 2 pages long. Okay, there's a lot of nuance depending on the topic that may not be capturable in only 2 pages. Donald Trump, don't give me a memo more than 3 paragraphs long. And, you know, I mean, simplifications without considering when they're appropriate can be very dangerous. Go ahead.
So I just want to add one thing. This is related to the beginning of COVID when we are getting mixed messages. I believe at that time, whatever studies related to virus, like, you know, washing their hands, that definitely prevents like, you know, common cold and stuff like that. Not have much knowledge about COVID. And whatever, I mean, whatever was through the media, whatever we got was based on that. Like wash your hands, and frankly speaking, all of us were in a very different kind of a mode, like what's going to happen if we don't do that. So based on the, I mean, whatever studies or whatever we had, we were told that we need to do it. So it is again.
Yeah, we had to work with what we had. I didn't know. I didn't know what COVID was. It was called nCoV-2 at that point. And I didn't know what was going to happen if I went and breathed in air. I didn't even know. I had a feeling that aerosol transmission was going to be an issue. I talked about it with Michael, but nobody else was talking about it. So we just had to work what we had.
I'm going to also point out to you that you said, well, based on the common, except, again, this was just a oversimplification without looking. All of the analysis of past coronaviruses strongly suggested that there was no fomite transmission. That all got overlooked.
Yeah.
All right. Similarly, hello, we're in a pandemic. The US spent 20 years writing plans for what to do in a pandemic. What did they do with those plans? They threw them in the wastebasket and decided to go off of the Truthies instead.
Yeah, so we had another one sometime in, I think, mid this decade. That was Ebola. That was handled so well. We hardly came to know of.
Right.
But then COVID really went out of hand.
Yes. All right. I see somebody there who has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess, and we can actually even go back to COVID if we want to, because like I understand the dangerousness of oversimplifying, but if I was trying to manipulate the public, not the media, not policymakers, but the public, it seems like I could either do that by oversimplifying or complexifying, if that's even a word, right? I mean, there are two ways to manipulate people. One is to reduce the question, you know, George H.W. Bush, do you support our troops, right? You simplify it to where it's not even part of the real question. Or I just throw so much information at you that you can no longer, you know, get through it, which in some ways is what happened with COVID when policy experts were speaking out, right? It was, they could not convey that much information to people. And so that's where they started to get in trouble. So anyway, there's something which almost sounds like the policymakers are getting their feedback loop from the media, but in fact, I feel like policymakers are actually manipulating the media and, you know, participating in this oversimplifying in order to more to manipulate the public than the media is manipulating the policymakers. But anyway, I was just curious about your thoughts on that.
I think you have succinctly stated a, for lack of a better word, left-right divide on where how that feedback loop works. And depending on the issue, there are those on one side that will then start with the, oh, well, it's the policymakers feeding this. And on a different issue, people on the other side will take the same position. So you certainly have described a feedback loop that is there. Unfortunately, it's one that can be, shall we say, seen, constructed, an as-if simplification of itself to many situations. So I understand that you see it. I'm not going to disagree that it may or may not be there. I tend
let's take critical race theory
to explain what's going on.
Let's take critical race theory. Having, you know, been involved in the early parts of that when that was starting out as a theory, to hear the media talk about it is definitely, not only is it oversimplification, it's actually just incorrect.
Well,
it's incorrect. So it's not oversimplified. It's not critical race theory.
It's not what you believe critical race theory to be, but the label critical race theory is being used by other people to mean something else. So it is the same label being applied to multiple things. But
it's not what the theory itself.
The label is in common. The fact that you could say, well, that isn't, no, it isn't how you use the label, but it is how they are using the label. And you may not like that that's how they use the label, but that's how they're using the label.
Yeah, I guess then there's, so if this is really, so if you're talking about the issue of propaganda and spin, like the Clean Skies Act was a way of selling carbon credits. Okay, so polluting a sky has been turned into something that it was not meant to be. So if the point is that people have historically always manipulated information to spend it and or use it for propaganda, yes, the easiest way to do that is, again, I would say not only to simplify, but also to make things overly complex. Either way, you're getting people, the public, out of the conversation, and you're limiting it to a small group of people who can do it on their own interest.
All right, fully agreed. So I'm going to, for the sake of just keeping this to time, to the extent that you can go and look at a website that is entitled overcomingrancor.com, you will see lots of writings of mine about how to get the public or an audience back involved and shift the focus from the protagonists up at the front of the room to the audience watching the protagonist in the rest of the room. And it's a process called Buberian dialogue, which goes to the Martin Buber concept of I and thou. And usually we treat audiences as it's and ignore them. And the question is, can you treat the audience as a thou and include them in the conversation? So I will point you to overcomingrancor.com.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Should we go back to the conversation we had earlier? Did you want to address that?
Yeah, I think that's about the science part. And the, so basically, if I leave the room now, I got your points that the sloppy science want to be blamed. And but I'm not scientist, I'm not defending self-defense, but I'm thinking for scientists, they know the limitation. Everybody knows, and the science doesn't know everything, but the public doesn't recognize that. I'm saying the problem is the public doesn't realize the limit of the science. So
We're in full agreement. The
Yeah.
question becomes, how do you communicate that?
yeah, that's one of my questions to you is that I don't want to leave the room that, okay, the problem is the scientist.
No,
There's
the
lobby.
problem is the
So
communication
how do we,
about the science.
okay.
Now, there are scientists, Dr. Fauci being an example, who will jump to the extreme simple point of view, not tell you any of the nuances, not tell you about any of the limitations. And when asked about it, go, well, of course, everyone's aware of it. That doesn't work. Right? So yes, it may be that all the scientists well-trained in the field are well aware of the limitations, but you're talking to a context of people that are not aware of those.
Yeah, that's my question. How design thinking help us to communicate?
If you take as the object that you are trying to design a process of better communication where the questions get surfaced and you ask about the affordances of the shortcuts. So if what you are trying to design is a process that causes the surfacing of these things, design thinking can give you a solution. If you apply the design thinking only to the communication, the noun, and not the communicating, the process, you are unlikely to get a good result, because it is easy to produce a communication artifact that those in the know think is fine.
Mhm.
And that those not in the know, not knowing the limitations, just accept. So you're just going to get positive feedback that doesn't mean anything.
Well, I just wanted to ask, so what have you simplified for your presentation here today?
Everything, because you can't possibly talk about 20 years worth of work in an hour without simplifying and probably oversimplifying. So I come back to, and thank you for the invitation, because I get to sum up one last time. So here's the simplifications. Okay. One, we are cognitively limited beings. We do not have the equipment in our heads to process more than 3 to 7 unrelated variables at the same time. We do not live in a world that is describable by 3 to 7 unrelated variables at the same time. So we only have 2 choices. Find a way to make things relate to one another, because again, the limitation is on unrelated things, or limit what you pay attention to. We do both. If you recognize that, then many of the things that you treat as facts are actually as if facts. And if you grant their as if status, they then become much more open to change, as opposed to you treating them as this reified concrete thing. Requisite variety matters. If you have something that cannot be controlled within those domains of 3 to 7 things, a human is not going to be able to control it. It's just outside of our abilities. Jensens matters. No matter how much we like to ignore it, these things are not transitive. You cannot just take an average, a mean, a sample, a shortcut, and say, oh, if I understand how a function applies to that, I understand how it applies to the whole. It just doesn't work. And then you have to turn around and say, what do I do about all of this? And what I do about all of this is to recognize all these things have in common a taking of shortcuts. So you ask, what is it that allows the shortcuts to work? What is it that affords meaning and functionality to the shortcut? And if you can keep asking that, you'll make some progress. And that's my general simplification of 25 years of work and an hour and a quarter of blabbing in 2 minutes.
And perhaps linking design and science can help us with better policy then?
Again, design and
Design
what
thinking
design
as outcome,
okay,
and
design
science process together can
right. Well, if you
help
put
us identify the
well, if you again, if you the way you put them together is this focus on
simplification.
no process versus results, communicating versus the communication. All right, how do the people that are the users understand what it is they're using instead of merely looking at their use? what is the story that goes into the use? That's where the linkage is.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Michael and Brenden.
And thank you, the audience.
Yeah, we had an online,
Yeah.
thank you, online audience.
Thank you all.
Yes.
And physical audience.
All right. Bye, everyone.